You know, I didn't really like the intro I made for the last video, and I only made it because I forgot to have like a hello in the video, so hello! We're not going to use that old intro. Welcome back to my Top 10 Album series, the series where I slowly but surely create my Top 10 album list by listening to a few albums at a time and seeing whether they can go up against the crucible of what is my current Top 10 favorite albums list. This video, we are going to cover 4 albums spanning from country to jazz, and we're going to have a good time doing it, gosh darn it. Okay, recenter, Caleb. Less aggressive. Less aggressive. So without further ado, let's jump into the first album that we are going to be talking about today, Cuong Vu Trio meets Pat Metheny. This is a jazz album that came out in 2016, a familiar year for our list, and it pairs Cuong Vu up against Pat Metheny. Pat Metheny is a jazz guitarist, and Cuong Vu is a trumpeter, and he had been in Pat Metheny's band for quite some years, and they had often talked about collaborating on an album. This is the actual culmination of those discussions. And you can definitely hear the sense of collaboration and familiarity on the album as not just those two, the two who have the name of the album, but also the other two in the trio come together to really create a atmospheric, sometimes chaotic, but oftentimes very lovely jazz sound. I especially like how the first 2 songs kind of both confront the listener and then acclimate them to the album. It starts out with Wu's trumpet, and then as the rest of the trio comes in, it does create that kind of chaotic energy to it. But as that song Acid Kiss progresses, you feel more and more the atmosphere and the vibe that they want to go for, leaning into, as the title would suggest, acid jazz. But then Pat Metheny's guitar comes in, and at the end of the song, it's just him sliding the notes, sliding up the neck, and it creates this very kind of weird, stretched out closer that then is almost picked up on with the next song. Not Crazy, Just Gain Up, and begins with Metheny's guitar and then creates a really cool relationship between how he's playing his guitar and the more bouncy trumpet that we're hearing from Wu that is different enough but still akin to what we heard on Acid Kiss. And it's this variety of complementary relationships between the instruments that plays throughout the album that gives it such a wonderful atmosphere. And it's that variety too that has made this such a prevalent album in my listening habits. Is an album that I can put on in a lot of different scenarios while I'm working and I just kind of need some background music. When I'm driving through the city at night, when I'm at a function and there just needs to be kind of some background music. Not all the songs necessarily would fit with that, but there are certainly a lot of songs on here that just blend very nicely with kind of a room ambience. So Cuong Vu Trio meets Pat Metheny has been a constant re-listen since I first heard it back in 2016. But will that be enough for it to secure a spot on the list? We will have to see at the end of this video. For now, we will hop to our next album, 9 to 5 and Other Odd Jobs by Dolly Parton. If you look at my list, there is a big gap in time between the 70s and the 2000s. We're going to start to rectify that today, although with an album that came out at the very beginning of the 80s, so it still is very much in that kind of 70s oeuvre. This album is of course known for its titular single, which also tied into the film of the same name, 9 to 5. 9 to 5 is of course the anthem of getting up and going to a job which you do not like, you are not appreciated for, and yet you will make it through. You build up dreams just to watch them shatter. You're just another step on the boss man's ladder, but you've got dreams you'll never take away. There is an enduring optimism to both this song and the entire album. It is the perfect tone setter, and it is one of those just kind of classic songs that automatically, when the piano hits at the beginning, it gets you in the mood to go on a journey with Dolly. Dolly Parton is, of course, first and foremost a country star. However, that didn't stop her from mixing in some really cool genre mixing into this album. Hush by Hard Times is made up of folk, country, and rock, while her cover of House of the Rising Sun is clearly disco influenced. And just as she covers a wide range of genres, she also tells a wide range of stories with various different protagonists from different lines of work and labor, socioeconomic class, most evidently on her song Deportee, which was originally written by Martin Hoffman and Woody Guthrie, but she covers just very beautifully telling the story of some Mexican workers who came up to America and then were deported, but Upon their deportation, their plane crashed. Dolly covers this with such empathy. Dolly is not interested in anything but fully humanizing these souls who were tragically lost. Now, as you may have picked up, she does cover a lot of songs on here, including Dark as a Dungeon, which is also covered by Johnny Cash on Folsom Prison, which is on the list. But she did write 4 songs for the album, each of which is a standout. And she ends the album with one of my favorite of her original songs, Poor Folks Town, which is a duet with Porter Wagner, who was a constant presence in a lot of Dolly's early discography, and is just really fun to hear them sing together in any song, but especially here. And now that I've done my duty as a Tennessean to include Dolly Parton in this series in some way, we will move on to our next 2 albums, both of which are by the same band, Public Service Broadcasting, and those are Race for Space and Every Valley. Public Service Broadcasting is a very unique band. They take archived interviews, TV broadcasts, documentaries, and they build songs around them. Race for Space is an album all about the space race. It is probably the most concept-y of concept albums that I will talk about in this series. The album kicks off with the title track, which soundtracks JFK's famous speech explaining why we ought to go to the moon, and sets the tone of the celebratory narrative that the album is going to focus on. A narrative that's very easy to buy into. I'm not exactly what you would call a patriotic person. However, I love NASA. And the space race was tied into the Cold War and all these geopolitics, and there was a lot of criticism at the time about whether those resources were actually the best to be spent, especially when there was so much poverty in America. However, I think wisely this album decides that that is stuff that is maybe a little bit too big for it to cover, and instead it is just focused on the human achievement of reaching for the stars, landing on the moon, spreading out into space. The first half of the album is focused mainly on the Russian side of things, with my favorite song on the album, Sputnik, being built around the signal that Sputnik sent back to the Earth, and then just an explosively fun song, Gagarin, based off of Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut to fly in space, the first man to fly in space. And then the back half of the album is mostly focused on NASA's side of things, with the centerpiece of the album being the song The Other Side, which is a good launching point off into the climax of the album, which is Go, a song that soundtracks the kind of countdown and control center based around the launch of the Apollo rockets. And finally, the last song on the album, Tomorrow, gives you kind of that optimism and hope for the future that you get in a lot of Race for Space things. It talks about coming back in the future and kind of creates this very nice chapter break, which is always a accomplishment when you're talking about history, because history doesn't have chapter breaks. Things flow into the next, and there is a continual story from the Apollo program and what the Russians were doing into what we are doing more privatizing space now. However, you can't have that for an album. You need to have an endpoint, and Tomorrow is a pretty good endpoint. Overall, The Race for Space is just this joyous, fun album that is tied into one of my favorite parts of history. Every Valley, on the other hand, was something I knew nothing about when I listened to it for the first time. Every Valley is about the mining industry in Wales, and specifically kind of building up to a big miner strike that happened. And so it focuses a lot more on the ground voices and interviews with just your kind of common everyday Welshmen. The songs also bleed together a little bit more on this album than they did for The Race of Space, and there is this kind of dark theming about the inevitability of time and change. There's also more collaboration on this album, including actual sung vocals on the song Progress. Those are sung by Tracy Ann Campbell, but you also get some on the song Turn No More. Those are done by James Dean Bradfield. And as you get into that back half of the album, and the narrative turns more and more about the strikes and the labor disputes, it gets a heavier sound and a more pro-worker stance. I mean, the whole album is pro-worker, but this is very specifically putting these miners up against the systems of power. But the album is able to find its way out of those darker parts, especially in the song You Plus Me, which has some lovely Welsh lyrics sung by Lisa Jen Brown, and one of the most beautiful album closers I've ever heard, with this lovely folk song sung by a choir of miners. It is actually the centerfold of the physical album, which I have in the other room, and is such a striking and beautiful way to end the album. It's like giving a final word to the people who this story is about, to the people who own this story. It gives them one final word, and it's beautiful. But the question arises, which of these albums, if any, can crack the top 10? The album to beat right now is Season 2 by Pamplemousse, and I kind of hate that I had to put it at number 10, but something has to go in that slot. It basically guarantees that means it will get kicked off the list. But the question is, will any of these albums be the one to do it? And the answer, for at least the first one, Cuong Vu Trio meets Pat Metheny, is yes. I went back and forth on this a lot because they are very different albums. People talk a lot about comparing apples to oranges, but you know what's harder? Comparing apples to a mason jar full of champagne. I don't have any apples, that's why I'm doing this. Where do you even begin here? You kind of just have to go with which one would you want to have more often. And Season 2 is a great album. However, I think it's a little bit less versatile than the Cuong Vu Trio. So, this is a very fraught analogy. I don't even like champagne. If anyone wants a mason jar of champagne, hit me up. I don't think I can actually mail this to you. I think you can't mail alcohol over the mail system. But if you live in Nashville, I'll hand it to you. Anyway, Cuong Vu gets to be the new number 10 spot. It's the orange. Yay. This is a very pathetic looking orange. Well, okay, but what about the other ones? 9 to 5, Dolly Parton. This one hurts. Because like I said, I'm from Tennessee. Dolly Parton is our patron saint. It should crack the album, and there is almost a chance where it does. You get into this interesting thing, much like comparing oranges to champagne. You start to run into this problem where, well, maybe it's better than number 8, but it's not as good as number 9. And then you kind of create that weird thing where it's like, well, why are we making a linear list? This is a Sisyphean task, is it not? And the answer is yes. Anyway, the point is, I actually like it more than At Folsom Prison, which is the other country album on the list, but I don't like it as much as Shouted Written Down or the Cuong Vu Trio. So it isn't able to crack that list, but if it did, it would actually rank higher than the highest ranked country album. Lists are arbitrary and kind of stupid. Please don't stop watching this series, though. And finally, you have the 2 public service broadcasting albums. Now, the question you have to ask first is, which do you like better? Race for Space is an album that I would recommend to people more easily. It is a more accessible topic, and I think it is a little bit more fun. The narrative certainly is a little bit more fun. However, Every Valley feels a little bit more, a little bit more personal, and it expands the sound a little bit more by adding in collaborators and the lyrics. So I think I have to personally go with Every Valley. Race for Space and Every Valley would bump off the Cuong Vu Trio, but I don't think they would go up against Shouted and Written Down. Every Valley would. I would put Every Valley above that. I don't think I'd put the Race for Space. And so what that leaves us with is this kind of weird space where 3 of the albums kind of technically make it onto the list, but 2 of those are automatically knocked off. However, Every Valley is our new addition to the top 10. It sits in at number 9, right below At Folsom Prison, right above Shouted, Written Down, and Quoted. And if you would like to know about the other albums on that list, hey, that's what my whole last episode was about. So if you want to watch that, you can click the link down in the description below. And as always, I am taking recommendations for albums to listen to and to consider for the list, so you can leave those in the comments below. However, I have to go and make a very weird supplementary video about vegetables and country music. So I will see you next time. Happy listening, friends.